Welcome, everybody. We are so excited that you are able to join us here for our second session in the Apathy to Action education series. My name is Shay DeGolier. I am the Director of Campaigns and Network Support. I've been at Indivisible for a little over 6 years now, so I've been here for a while, and I'm really looking forward to the session with you all tonight. To start with, we're going to go over a few housekeeping things. First, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. If you click CC, the bottom of your Zoom screen, closed captioning will come on. Tonight, we're going to use the Q&A function. If you have any questions for our presenter, it's easier for us to keep track of, and we want to try and be really efficient so we can get through as many questions as possible tonight. If you're having issues with the Q&A function, you can use the chat. Just put the word ask or question in front of it so we know to look out for that. Our presenter can also see all of the Q&As in chat, so try and be mindful of where we're putting them so we can follow them and track them pretty seamlessly. Our top asked question, tonight's call is being recorded, so if you have technical issues or if you have to hop off early, you will get the recording tomorrow in a follow-up email. No worries about that. We'll also send all of the resources that we shared tonight in a follow-up email. Please keep your mics muted. There's going to be a lot of people on the call tonight. We want to be respectful of everybody's time and our presenters' time. So please use the Q&A function or the chat if you want to engage with us tonight. And please stay on at the end. We have a little short survey after the presentation about your experience tonight, and that helps us build all of our future calls and make sure that they're engaging and informative. So please don't hop off before that. All right, before we jump in tonight, I want to do a very quick overview of the Apathy to Action series. For any of you who were with us last month, we started with our first session in partnership with Right to Be on bystander intervention and de-escalation tactics. Tonight, we are so excited that Protect Democracy is here to walk us through some of the authoritarian threats that our democracy faces. And then next month, on September 19th, will be our third session with the opportunity agenda around crafting personal stories that are compelling to connect with other people in our community, both in one-on-one conversation and through online and social media. And in a couple minutes, Kimberly will drop in the chat the one-pager to sign up and register for the rest of those calls. All right, the reason we are all here tonight, I am so excited to introduce Dina from Protect Democracy. She is a counsel and director of impact at Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. But we're so excited that you're here. She is working with Protect Democracy, as I mentioned, a nonprofit organization with the mission of preventing American democracy from declining into a more authoritarian
There's an
form of
echo of
government.
your voice.
Kimberly, can you go through the chat? She oversees the organization's work to build democratic resilience against the authoritarian movement in the medium term, as well as its long-term work to drive the structural change needed to secure a pluralistic, multiracial democracy of tomorrow. She's also led impact litigation to secure accountability for abuses of executive power at the state and federal levels. And she's a former federal law clerk, assistant United States attorney, and U.S. Fulbright scholar, born and raised in Ohio and currently living in the Northeast. Dina, we are so grateful that you're here with us tonight and so excited for this presentation. So I will hand it off to you now.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you to Indivisible. Hi, everyone. I am so pleased to be here with you for part 2 of this important series from Apathy to Action. I'm going to kick things off with a general observation, maybe a hot take, that humans are just not wired for democracy. And I don't mean just now, I mean ever. I mean, if you think about it, over the course of human history, only a small fraction of civilizations in the world have been governed democratically. We don't run our businesses democratically. We don't run our families or schools democratically. And that's because it is hard to build and maintain a democracy. I wanted to start here because it kind of gives us perspective on our problem today. First, that yes, democracy is struggling right now. And also democracy struggling is the rule in human society, not the exception. And second, yes, democracy is not a self-sustaining natural order. So we can recognize and celebrate that democracy is actually our choice. It's our choice, and that means it requires work to commit to that choice and realize its upsides. Apathy there works against us. But choice also means freedom and agency, and those things are usually antidotes to apathy. So with that, let's dig in to the threats our democracy faces right now. I'm going to give you a preview of where we're headed. First, I'll situate our conversation in the broader trend of rising authoritarianism around the world, and then focus on what is happening in the US. This is a generational trend that is much more about, it's about much more than any one person, party, or election. Then we'll talk about some theories for how we got here, and then what we can do to move forward with some ideas that you can engage with as you carry forward. And we'll pause at each of these frames to see if we have any questions. So let's talk about the global decline of democracy. It's been in retreat for most of the 21st century. Today, more countries and more people are governed non-democratically than at any point in the last 20 years. In 2023, 71% of the world population, that's an increase from 48% 10 years ago, lived in countries classified as autocracies by one of the major democracy indexes based out of Sweden. It's called Varieties of Democracy Index, or VDEM. So just in this context, what do we mean by democracy? Different analysts and rankings use slightly different factors, but at its core, it includes free and fair elections in which different candidates and parties can compete, government constraints by some system of checks and balances, rule of law, including due process and equal application of the law, and protecting civil liberties for minorities and opposition, so free speech, associational rights. These are things that we've largely taken for granted in the US for our lifetime. They go fundamentally to our ability to choose our collective destiny and ability to live our lives as we wish. So democracy has historically come in waves. The first wave came in the 19th century, second wave came after World War II. The third wave started in the late 1980s and crested in 2007 before turning to 18 years of gradual decline in global freedom. And you can see the wave here, this wave of autocratization. In 2023, 35% of the world's population lived in countries that are becoming more autocratic. That means they're on the trend line towards more autocratic. What's helpful about these data is they assess trends over time. So this chart here looks at scores over the last decade, and it's generally not a good picture in any corner of the world, and you can see that sweeps in the United States. Freedom House's data, another one of the indexes, also shows that U.S. democracy score was beginning to decline as far back as 2011 when President Obama was in the White House, and it really accelerated under the Trump presidency. Also worrying is that we're seeing a real shift in people's attitudes towards democracy. So a generation ago, 1 in 16 Americans were open to army or military rule, and today that number has jumped to 1 in 5. And significantly, it's actually attitudes among younger Americans that are driving this trend. Answers on the survey ask, to what degree do you think it's essential to live in a democracy? And older Americans overwhelmingly say that's true, and younger Americans much less so. That's not hard to understand. For Gen Zers whose first election may have been 2016 or 2020, democracy is not really winning hearts and minds. They keep hearing it's an existential election. They're trying to vote amid a global pandemic. You can see a lot of obstacles to really connecting. So that's, before we get into sort of the result of these trends, I want to just pause here and see if we have any questions. And I'm going to ask Shay for some help tracking the chat.
Hi, yes, we don't have any questions specific to that first section.
Okay, great. We'll keep going.
Shay, there was one in the chat that I was just popping over. Looking at your graph, there's a question about what happened in 2010-ish to pop autocracies so high. So in your chat, something happened in 2010. What happened?
In 2010. So there's not really I can't identify an isolated event that drove a particular spike. But we'll get to later, we'll get to sort of like what is driving this overall trend and this democratic decline. And you will see that there are some of the theories get at some of the demographic changes in the country that were potentially signaled by Obama's presidency. And so there may be some links there. But right now I don't know the exact, what triggered it exactly in 2010 to have a starker turn. All right, so the result of these trends are that we've gotten this wave of 21st century autocrats around the world in the last 2 decades. And when my organization, Protect Democracy, launched back in the beginning of 2017, one of the first things we did was to ask experts who've studied democratic decline in the 21st century, what do these autocratic-minded leaders do? What should we expect here in the United States if we go down the same road as some of these other countries? And one thing that we learned from these experts was that unlike autocracies in the 20th century, in the 21st century, autocratic movements overtake democracy not by the barrel of a gun, but by the point of a pen. They don't abolish democracy, they maintain the veneer of it. And they said that also there's a common playbook that they all deploy. Fundamentally, autocrats believe that they're the only legitimate source of power, and any check on their power is illegitimate. So our scholars mapped out this authoritarian playbook for us in January 2017, and it generally has 7 tactics. And I'm going to go through each of the tactics and kind of give you examples so you can spot them in the wild. But let me give you first a kind of high-level view of how they operate together to consolidate authoritarian power over time. So in action, these tactics together create a reinforcing cycle or feedback loop. The authoritarian strategy, big picture, is completely to transform government power from the inside, from a system of checks and balances and separation of powers into a system of no checks and consolidated power. And they do this by retaliating against opponents and marginalized communities and stoking violence, which gets people to fall in line and really clear the field of opposition. They even get people to obey in advance of any retaliation by mere threat and instigation of fear. That's what historian Timothy Snyder calls anticipatory obedience, obeying even before you are targeted because of fear. And with fewer and weaker forces standing up to reinforce checks and balances, the democratic institutions start to fail, allowing power to be further consolidated. So let me go through now tactic by tactic what this looks like. The first tactic is corrupting elections. While maintaining the facade of elections as an imprimatur of legitimacy. And this can be, done by sowing distrust in the process and pressuring election officials to subvert that process. But it can also be, by signing laws that pull out the foundation on which our free and fair elections rest. So on January 6th, we saw an effort to block the certification of election results involving coordination among state and local officials and former President Trump and his advisors. When they failed, the authoritarian movement worked in states to push laws that would clear the obstacles that stood in their way. So through the 2021 and 2022 state legislative sessions, we, along with our partners, tracked nearly 400 legislative proposals that would make election subversion more likely. 56 of them ultimately became law in 26 states. So this map here is from a report we call Democracy Crisis in the Making, and it shows, this is the May 2023 update. It shows that these are all the states where state legislatures could do things like usurp control over election results, require partisan or unprofessional election audits or reviews, seize power over election responsibilities, create unworkable burdens in election administration, or impose disproportionate criminal or other penalties. There are proposals or enacted bills in each of these states. So the second tactic now is bringing independent institutions under presidential power and politicizing them. That means taking the immense legal and regulatory powers of the government, institutions like the Justice Department, the Nonpartisan Civil Service, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and turning them into tools to punish perceived enemies and reward allies. So I'll give you a few examples. You may remember when former President Trump pushed the Postmaster General to leverage postage rates against Amazon after its owner, Jeff Bezos, who also owned the Washington Post, had drawn Trump's ire for the paper's criticism of his administration. Or you might remember when former President Trump tried to block the merger between AT&T and Time Warner to get at Time Warner company, to get back at CNN, which is a Time Warner company, for its critical coverage. A more recent example comes out of Texas, where the Attorney General Paxton has been wielding his office's power to intimidate nonprofits and Catholic charities that provide humanitarian aid to migrants without justification, according to a state judge. Now, the third tactic, it's not surprising, this one, it's a core tenet of the playbook, is really to consolidate power in the executive, including through ignoring or weakening the legislature or co-opting the courts as would-be checks on executive power. These executive power grabs include things like overriding Congress's power of the purse by declaring national emergencies when there is no emergency and unlocking emergency spending powers, or naming acting officials to cabinet positions and senior posts to circumvent Congress's advice and consent role in nominations. It also includes pushing out of the party anyone willing to check autocratic behavior so that Congress's impeachment and oversight powers really become non-starters. Now, the judiciary has been no more resilient. The Supreme Court recently granted unprecedented immunity to the president for committing crimes while in office. And it has gradually been narrowing the scope of its judicial review by finding more and more cases non-justiciable or unable to be decided by the courts because of things like the plaintiff's lack of standing or the presence of political questions. So the fourth tactic, spreading disinformation, really core to the way autocrats consolidate and preserve power and target the opposition, is through coordinated disinfo campaigns, which create kind of smoke screens or justifications for power grabs. Of course, the classic example here is the big lie that Joe Biden was not the rightful winner of the 2020 election, which fueled the January 6th attack on the Capitol and certification process. We've also seen disinformation campaigns to justify extreme action and power grabs at the border, including a DHS and DOJ report from 2018 that made false links between terrorism and immigration, and current narratives perpetuated really without evidence by some Texas officials about non-citizen voting. Next is, the other side of the coin of spreading regime propaganda is quashing dissent, including censoring political speech, protest, and the media. The tools in this toolkit are really varied. They include deploying militarized force to the streets to quash protest, like we saw in 2020 during racial justice protests. But they also include more subtle tactics like threatening to revoke a news outlet's broadcast license, or unfounded reputational attacks on whistleblowers. Think of, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who testified in the first impeachment proceedings against former President Trump and the smear campaign that he endured as a result. Or think of, state anti-protest bills, which are kind of taking hold across the country. Or, even simple intimidation, like calling for an investigation of a journalist who has written about threats to our democracy. Sixth is a lot of what we've been talking about so far is using machinery and regulatory and legal infrastructure to wield power. But sometimes it involves brute force, like either state-directed or inciting private violence to intimidate and silence dissent. And this can come from officials, for example, licensing violence, such as Texas Governor Abbott pardoning a man who shot and killed a Black Lives Matter protester in 2020, or by condoning or at least not repudiating political violence, like we saw in Charlottesville. Now, this last tactic, scapegoating vulnerable communities, is perhaps the oldest and most classic of the autocratic tactics, because if you pit people against each other based on race, religion, national origin, or sexual orientation, it is easier for the authoritarian to rise to power. And in the meantime, vulnerable groups suffer disproportionate harm. Okay, so let me stop here and see if there are any questions in the chat. Shay, if you have your hand.
The only Q&A question I saw is, what is the possibility of somebody being a plant and using that as a tactic on the left?
I think, the threats to information security are always something to be aware of. So, that's both sort of through phishing and cyber attempts, and that could come, the both foreign or domestic, or it could be, in person. So that's a good sort of note for everyone to kind of keep those kinds of things in mind, and have the kind of precautions like we're having here of knowing who is kind of entering and registering for events, and that kind of thing is, I think, are good best practices.
Another question is your report available? Will we be able to send this out to people afterwards?
Yes, we do have, my organization published a report called The Authoritarian Playbook that kind of goes through each of these tactics and gives examples both in the US and globally of what they look like in action, and really how to tell what is an autocratic tactic at play and what is sort of politics as usual, because in our day and age of pretty aggressive political tactics, it can sometimes be hard to tell if something is an authoritarian tactic or if it's really just kind of bluster. And this guide kind of tries to help people identify certain criteria and context for really talking about autocratic threats, and naming them as such.
And one final question. Are the new Supreme Court measures like Chevron that diminish government agency power part of creating an autocracy?
The protections for the civil service and sort of a nonpartisan expert executive branch agency is one of the threats. I think it's one of the guardrails that we see really weakening over time. So if you think about all the different types of guardrails that kind of hold in our democracy and keep political actors following the rule of law and avoiding sort of overreach, the civil service play a really key role there, because they are by design hired to implement policy based on their expertise and impartial decision making, rather than through politicized frames. And so the weakening of sort of the civil service and nonpartisan agency heads is one weakening guardrail that could make it easier to politicize agencies and drive sort of politicized action by them in the future.
Thank you. I think we can go to the, sorry.
Should I keep going?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just thinking back on that last section, this stuff is terrible, right? So naturally it invites the question, why is this happening? How did we get to where American democracy is so susceptible to authoritarianism, and where so many of us are struggling with apathy, no less, amid these threats? I wish I could give you a definitive answer. I can't, but I can give you an introduction to some of the dominant theories out there in the sort of political and social sciences that people are discussing. And this may, for folks who are kind of curious about those graphs earlier, may kind of shed some light on what's happening there behind the graphs. So one of the theories is that Western democracy is simply no longer delivering the goods. And now I'm thinking back to 2020 or 2009, 2010, someone was asking about, I think that was amid a real recession, right? That was after the market had crashed and there was the American economy was really struggling. So that could be part of it. So this graph that you're looking at here is the famous elephant graph by CUNY economist Branko Milovic, which shows that over the past several decades, incomes for the poorest 80% of the global population have skyrocketed, as have incomes for those at the very tip of the elephant's trunk, the top 1% or top 10th or 100th of a percent. But where the elephant's trunk is dragging on the ground is sort of the 80, 90th percentile of global income distribution. That's actually the middle class in Western Europe and the United States, and their incomes have stagnated. So if you read sort of the histories of political order, what it will tell you is that as goes the middle class, so goes your political system. If the middle class wants a hereditary monarchy, you'll get a hereditary monarchy. If the middle class wants a representative democracy, you're going to get a representative democracy. And right now, that's the segment of society that wields enormous political power is kind of saying, hey, the system really isn't working for us. Maybe we should look for something different. And folks are left with a feeling that their lives really don't change based on who is in power. And so they disengage from politics or are potentially open to a strongman who promises to override the system that isn't working. So that's theory number one out there. Theory number two is what we call kind of the atomization of modern society, which you get versions of this on the left. That's Bob Putnam's book, The Upswing, and on the right, Patrick Deneen, one of the so-called post-liberals, have both written about this idea that basically we are too individualistic a society and that we don't have a sense of community or common good or shared purpose. And without that, it's very hard to have a functioning, healthy democratic system. So Putnam has this graph that's in the middle there, where he tracks a whole bunch of different data sets in order to make the claim that 130 years ago, we were a very individualistic society during the Gilded Age, but we became much more communitarian over the course of the 20th century to that peak of the mountain in the middle of the graph in the early 1960s. And then we've become much more individualistic again. And if you kind of track that sort of tracks the metrics on the health of democracy and the health of society. Then Deneen and the post-liberals kind of make the same argument that in their view, liberalism as an ideology lionizes the individual in a way that is inconsistent with having a shared purpose, a set of common goods, and frankly, a functioning democratic form of government. And all these trends are exacerbated, some will say, by social media, which turns us against one another and pulls us apart rather than better connecting us. But that's not the only trend we've seen change over the last 50 years, I'd say. We've seen substantial increases in diversity in this country and all of the benefits that come with that. And that leads us to the third theory, which is backlash to demographic change. So this was first articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois after Reconstruction when he wrote in 1935 that if there was one thing South Carolina feared more than bad Black government, it was good Black government. The argument there was that fundamentally, if electing African Americans to the legislature in South Carolina produced a perfectly functional government, nothing was more threatening to the white supremacist ideology than that. And Ta-Nehisi Coates revived this argument after the Obama administration in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power, arguing essentially that whether you agreed or disagreed with Barack Obama's politics or policies, he was every bit as normal a president as George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And that in and of itself was very threatening to the existing social order that has dominated this country since its founding. And there is some data to back this up. The National Academy of Science has put out a paper in 2018 that showed one of the strongest predictors of support for Donald Trump in 2016 was perceived social status, loss on behalf of those groups, parts of our society who used to feel sort of hegemonic control over the direction of society. Frankly, white, male, Christian, rural men. This theory has not held up quite as well, but then that leads us to kind of the last theory. The one that I think we probably subscribe to the most is the all of the above theory. And that's that we're living through kind of a fundamental reordering of the tectonic plates on the Earth's crust. There are these big, giant social changes, like those plates on the Earth's crust, shifting the underlying conditions, like a volcano kind of stirring magma and lava up from the Earth's surface. And we've just talked about some of the things that are included at the bottom there, like neoliberalism, changing demographics, and labor markets. The lava might stay in the base of the volcano, except for the fact that there are these accelerants that are kind of stirring the pot and heating it up. And you can see those in the second layer there, social media included, and they're moving the lava further up the cone of the volcano. And maybe that's where they would stay, except all these checks and balances that we've had to kind of keep them in are faltering, and could blow off, and then you could get an explosion. So whether the metaphor is perfect storm or the volcano, it's kind of a combination of all of these things. Now, regardless of which of these theories you subscribe to, it's pretty clear that this is happening, that we're kind of getting a global shift away from democracy and towards possible alternative forms of government. I'm going to turn in a bit to what we can do about this, mainly focusing on the accelerants and the checks and balances. But to set that up, I kind of want to unpack a couple of the accelerants that I think are most relevant to this conversation and series: the democratic distortions in our electoral system and group polarization. So before I do that, let me pause again and see if there are any questions.
Yeah. Let's see, there's a couple. How do you think AI and false images or videos will play into authoritarian control?
Also accelerants. I would say those are, they don't really create new threats that have not been sort of part of the autocratic playbook already, but they do accelerate and make it easier for those tactics to be deployed and to take hold and to kind of spread damage. So that you can think about them in the same way that one might think about some of the newer forms of social media that have come into the mix and can cause certain types of disinformation to really spread at an accelerated rate.
There are like 4 questions all around the same topic, so I'm just going to pick a general version of one. Is the most important thing in protecting our democracy voting?
Voting is the one of the most major checks on the autocrat. It is the ultimate check on an autocrat. So in some ways, yes, I would say it is one of the most important things. That is the expression of the will of the people and people power. I think that, part of what's tricky is that part of the authoritarian playbook is to corrupt elections and make it harder for voting to serve as a check on power. And so the kind of countering the autocratic threat has to both protect the electoral infrastructure itself, prevent the attacks on the freeness and fairness of voting, at the same time as people are actually exercising their right to vote.
Let's see. Do you agree that women are also a target of authoritarians?
I do. And there is certainly the autocratic playbook has sort of a gender oppressive element to it in its modern form, and some of the modern iterations that we have seen do attack women and gender. Women and gender minorities, I would say, bear the brunt of some of the harm of the autocratic playbook in action. And so it's no surprise actually that women's participation in pro-democracy movements has been sparked in some countries where attacks on women and gender minorities have been particularly pronounced, or the impacts of autocratic behavior and tactics and power grabs have really come at the cost of women and gender minorities. And so that mobilization is actually really critical to and participation in women's participation in pro-democracy movements. It has historically been a good indicator of a democracy's likelihood of restoring itself.
Maybe one more before we move on. Let's go through. Has displacement caused by war and political oppression led to greater fear of migrants and willingness to accept an erosion of democracy?
That is a complex question in my mind to answer. I think certainly migration can be migration for all of the reasons that it happens, including sort of changes in climate, can result in can be sort of some of these underlying conditions in the volcano. And we do know that part of the autocratic playbook, scapegoating marginalized communities, often the first targets are immigrant and migrant populations. And so because they are, from an autocrat's perspective, easy targets, they're outside the electorate and have less access to the system, democratic institutions and systems, and fewer rights than citizens. They are a prime target, and targeting migrants first can really open, take the guardrails off, using expanding executive power in that context can then open the executive power, and then it remains aggrandized over time when used in other contexts as well. Okay, so let me come back to it's true that all sorts of democracies around the world are in decline. It's also true that the United States has been declining faster and is clearly more threatened than any other established democracy. And so question is, why is global democratic recession hitting so hard here? And we have somewhat of an explanation for this. When comparing our electoral system to other democracies around the world, what really screams out is not that the deck is stacked in favor of one party or another, but that there seems to be a structural advantage for authoritarians. And that is something that is unique to the US system and the way in which we elect our leaders. It's not that the authoritarian factions are somehow bigger in the US than they are in Germany or Finland. It's that our electoral system makes it so that extreme factions have an easier path to power. So let me just illustrate. In January 2016, Trump had a 33% favorability rating among general election voters, but he was able to parlay that into 50% in November and the presidency. And suddenly the autocratic faction is in power and unrestrained. So the biases in our system mean that strong support from a third of the electorate can be enough to win everything. And this is because of an effect that a political scientist named Lee Drutman calls the two-party doom loop. In a strict two-party systems, research finds that politics quickly become more antagonistic, tribal, and oppositional, and most voters begin to vote more against the other side's priorities than for their own values. This all originates from our winner-take-all electoral system, which doesn't just impact presidential elections. It is even more starkly illustrated by legislative elections in America. And this is the reason that only 8% of US House seats were regarded as competitive in the 2022 midterm election. So, this doom loop, this two-party doom loop, opens the door to authoritarianism, because when folks at each poll feel that it is an existential threat to let the other side win, and you can see that equally here in these charts, equally among Biden and Trump supporters in 2020, then we become more open to letting our side get away with anti-democratic behavior to get and keep power. And all it takes is for an authoritarian-minded candidate to emerge within one of the parties. The two-party doom loop also produces widespread disaffection among folks who are alienated and turned off by the heightened negative partisanship. Here we see the highest levels of self-identified independent voters that we've seen in recent history, 43%. These independents feel that neither party is their political home or represents their views and values. So I'm going to move now to how we kind of move forward from this crisis, but let me just see if there are any last questions on sort of the electoral system and why it is advantaging the authoritarian faction.
One question is, can the House refuse to certify the election results?
So that has been the subject of a big effort from pro-democracy forces following what happened on January 6, 2021 through the Electoral Count Reform Act. And so this federal legislation has been passed and makes it harder to subvert the certification process. There are also laws in place on the state level that make it unlawful. It is actually a crime not to for county officials not to certify the election, because those duties are not ministerial. So it would be it would be unlawful not to follow through with certification. Despite that, we do expect to see some of the same attempts at subverting the electoral certification process. Certainly our elections are I think our election is safer now than it was, but there do remain some vulnerabilities just by virtue of the fact that people will make choices under extreme pressure at times to participate in potential attempts like that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so how do we get out of this crisis? You're all here because you are committed to our democracy and have been out there in the field, and I'm sure you have your own reflections on sort of what's worked so far to keep our democracy from collapsing and what could work to strengthen our democracy. Love to hear your thoughts. Let me share with you how we've thought about it at Protect Democracy. This is just one way. There are many strong organizations out there, Indivisible included, kind of thinking through how to counter the autocratic threat. But let me share with you sort of our framework. We kind of think about it in phases. And here I'll analogize our democracy to kind of a destabilized house. First, when it comes to countering the tactics in the authoritarian playbook that we talked about, either at the federal or state level, we just have to stop the ceiling from caving in. You could think of it as rearguard action to prevent an autocrat in the executive branch from overriding checks and balances and governing by fiat, and most critically, ensuring free and fair elections. Second, we want to be able to walk away from the ceiling at some point. So how do we replace that cracking wooden ceiling beam with a steel one? We watch for reform windows and seize them when they appear to strengthen legislation and harden guardrails that reinforce separation of powers and checks and balances. And then, of course, the third, addressing the structural problems that are destabilizing our home, really fixing the structures and systems of democracy to be more up to date for the 21st century, and therefore more resilient over the next 250 years, hopefully. This also includes recognizing that our democracy has never been perfect. It's always left people behind, and really aiming to make it more inclusive while becoming more diverse as a country. Now, these phases are not sequential or serial. In fact, because of our two-party doom loop, we can find ourselves more than once with a caving in ceiling before we're able to really fix the deeper problems. So we should be working on them in parallel, even if they require different timelines. Let me give you an idea of what successful phase one or rearguard action could look like, since we spent time on the authoritarian playbook. I showed you that high-level authoritarian strategy that looks similar to this. A pro-democracy strategy seeks to disrupt that vicious cycle. So when autocratic forces wield power against their targets, pro-democracy actors stand up and challenge those abuses of power instead of being intimidated into silence. They're backed by a broad coalition and have the material resources they need. And then the institutions have the opportunity to check abuses of power, which disrupts the further consolidation of autocratic power. And even if the challenges don't always work, a reform window might eventually open for phase 2 and to strengthen some guardrails as part of those rebuilding efforts. Now, in the longer run, to build the democracy of tomorrow, there are many possibilities for reform efforts to amend the Constitution, to bridge building efforts at the local level, lots of green shoots. I'm going to share just 3 reforms that Protect Democracy is most focused on right now as a practical way to get out of the two-party doom loop and on a path to a more resilient democracy. So first, moving from the winner-take-all electoral system to a proportional system of representation. Second, in the meantime, building more parties and healthy ones that reflect the voices that are currently sidelined by our two-party system. And 3, legalizing fusion voting so that minor parties can have a real voice and mitigate extremism in our two-party system without creating a spoiler effect. Because as you know, right now, if you vote for third parties, often within our two-party system, whether that's at the state or federal level, it can have a spoiler effect. So because of the hyperpartisanship in our politics and society right now, it's hard to see that actually there's a lot of common ground. But one thing that the vast majority of Americans agree on, ironically, is that we are too divided. Despite recognizing that we are too divided, 7 in 10 Americans say that actually most of us want the same things out of life. And the polling bears that out as true. So take a look here. The vast majority of Americans agree on fundamental rights as important to the US's identity as a nation. 90% equal protection and the right to vote, 91% for equal protection and the right to vote, 90% for freedom of speech, 88% believe right to privacy is important to the US's identity as a nation. There's so much that we agree on about how we want to live as Americans and what kind of democracy we aspire to have. And that, I think, is what can solve some of the apathy problem and prompt people to action. Now, let me move to what each of us can do to help, and then we can have final questions at the end. We could support any of the concrete advocacy strategies that you might see taking place in a phase 1, 2, or 3. So that might be supporting legislation to reinforce guardrails in our democracy. A while back, the Protecting Our Democracy Act was introduced. There potential legislation around shoring up the Insurrection Act, which has a lot of vulnerabilities. It's an 18th century law that really creates vulnerabilities for using the military domestically. Or it could be some of those longer term strategies like moving towards proportional representation or kind of rebuilding party strength, or any of the sort of rearguard actions like we're talking about. But there are also things that we can do on an individual level. And I want to leave us with kind of four suggestions here. The first one is what we're kind of grappling with right now at this moment in our democratic decline is that so many of us still believe in our democracy and kind of have see it as unflappable and resilient when it isn't, right? When it's actually fragile and it requires work to keep it functioning. And so we need to kind of resist the myth of a dictator-proof democracy, right? Like our democracy actually needs us to stand up for it. At the same time, hope for resilience, right? We want to keep that hope alive, even while being really realistic that our democracy is not going to save itself. Second is, I mentioned this note about anticipatory obedience, when people kind of just out of fear stop doing what they're doing because they don't want to become a target of an autocratic actor. And that kind of just helps pave the way, even though it's done out of good intention, can help pave the way for an autocrat to kind of further consolidate power. So kind of keep an eye out for that. Help head it off by supporting allies who may be fearful, helping to identify maybe emergency resources, or kind of create coalitions to bring broader networks of support to organizations who may worry about being targeted. The third is I try to remind myself to do this regularly, is really just to expand information environments, the information that we take in beyond sort of the go-to echo chamber that we occupy. And that's for a lot of reasons. One, I think it helps to kind of be aware, have good threat awareness, but also, if you listen with curiosity and empathy, you can kind of see why certain attitudes and views have developed based on sort of the information that is pervading in particular ecosystems, and can really kind of round out, it can kind of act in just bringing that information into our own view can kind of counteract some of the effects of this two-party doom loop, where we're kind of having a lot of effective polarization because we don't really understand what the data points that someone else may have in their head. And then fourth, really supporting local democracy and community connection. I think really for the apathy problem, for people to connect to our democracy, sometimes it's really hard to do that on the national level. But on the local level, when it comes to, a school board, and maybe, there's a book ban on the table, or there's something else that kind of is motivating people to get engaged and really participate. It's a good way to kind of get involved and really start to build connections with people on a community and local level, working towards a common, bringing back that sense of sort of common good and shared purpose. So I'll leave with those thoughts, and Shay, open it back up for questions to end.
Okay. These might not all be from the last section. I think these are some that just trickled in. Are two actions that we could take that would be helpful: one, Supreme Court reform, and two, abolishing the Electoral College?
Yes, I think there is, I may stop my share also. These are reforms that are in the nature of democratizing our democracy. You have pointed to two institutions within our democracy that are the most counter-majoritarian and have been really susceptible to kind of creating what feel like results that are not representative of what the majority of people in the country are want to see in the country. And so those two are certainly good reforms, long-term reforms to put on the table. There are a lot of folks thinking about court reform right now, in particular term limits and ethics obligations and reforms. And then on electoral college, that requires constitutional level change. The types of changes I've been talking about are sub-constitutional because they are sort of closer within reach and can kind of put us on a path before kind of reaching for the constitutional level reforms. But certainly, if we want to ultimately make our solve some of the problems with our electoral system, the electoral college is something we should think about.
I think we have time for one more, so then we have a short survey at the end. Let's see. What do you think is the most impactful thing that has made our society find autocracy attractive?
Has made it what is sort of the leading contender for what's made our democracy, autocracy attractive to our democracy? I'm afraid I kind of fall into that all of the above camp with the volcano effect, of all the things that have kind of contributed. There is really something to this idea, though, that democracy is not delivering the goods, or people are not able to kind of see democracy on the national level as really translating to change and good change in their lives. And I think it's just our democracy doesn't feel representative or connected to the vast majority of people who are feeling, I remember the first time I saw that we are now at 43% unaffiliated with any party, which I think shows not that people are distrustful of the parties in this country for sure, but I think it's just this lack of a political home or sense of political belonging in the country that I think is what a lot of folks are really grappling with.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There are a few more questions. We don't have time for live, but maybe we can follow up with you afterwards and then send out some information to folks in our follow-up email. Thank you so much, Dina, for joining us and for answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we can work together again in the future.
Would love to. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the wonderful questions and engagement. This has been a really wonderful experience for me, and very motivating to know that there are so many folks out here who are engaged in this cause of moving from apathy to action.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, before folks hop off, on your screen is going to pop up a little survey, just 3 questions about your experience with us tonight. If you can just fill that out before you hop off. Again, thank you so much for joining us. As a reminder, our next session is next month, September 19th, on crafting compelling personal stories to engage with people in your community, both in person and online through social media. So take a couple minutes, answer the survey, and then thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next month. You'll get the recording and all of the resources and information in a follow-up email tomorrow.